The dusty streets of Redemption, Texas had never felt more suffocating than they did on that scorching August afternoon in 1878, when Eleanor Hartwell stood at her bedroom window and watched yet another suitor ride away from her father's ranch, his shoulders stiff with rejection and his horse kicking up clouds of red dirt that seemed to mirror the shame burning in her chest. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the sun-warmed glass, her fingers clutching the faded blue curtains her mother had sewn before the fever took her 3 years ago. She was 24 years old, considered a spinster by most standards in this harsh frontier town, and the reason was whispered about in every saloon, every church social, and every quilting circle from Redemption to San Antonio. The doctor in Austin had confirmed it 2 years prior, after she had fallen from a horse and suffered internal injuries. She would never bear children. The words had been clinical, matter of fact, but they had shattered her future as surely as a bullet through glass. Her father, Benjamin Hartwell, owned one of the most prosperous cattle ranches in this part of Texas, with 3,000 head of longhorn and enough land to make any man's mouth water with greed. Suitors had come calling with regularity after her mother's death, ostensibly to court Eleanor, but she knew the truth. They wanted the ranch, the cattle, the promise of inheritance. And they wanted sons to pass it all down to when Benjamin eventually went to his eternal rest. When each man learned of her condition, the courtship ended. Some were kind about it, making excuses about incompatibility or timing. Others were crueler, stating plainly that a woman who could not provide heirs was useless as a wife, particularly when she came with property that needed legitimate sons to inherit. The last suitor, Gerald Morrison, had actually laughed, a bitter sound that still echoed in Eleanor's memory. "What good is a ranch without boys to run it?" he had asked her father, right in front of her, as if she were a broken piece of farm equipment, rather than a living, breathing woman with a heart that could still love, and hands that could still work, and a mind that could still dream. Eleanor turned from the window, surveying her small bedroom with its simple furnishings, and the trunk at the foot of her bed that held her mother's wedding dress, a garment she had once imagined herself wearing. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. She could hear her father downstairs, the heavy tread of his boots on the wooden floorboards, and she knew he was disappointed again, though he tried to hide it behind gruff affection and reassurances that the right man would come along. But Eleanor had stopped believing in the right man. She had stopped believing that any man in this territory would see past her inability to bear children and want her for herself, for her quick mind and capable hands, for her skill with horses and her head for numbers that helped her father manage the ranch accounts, for the way she could read the weather and the behavior of the cattle and predict a storm 2 days before it arrived. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the smooth banister her father had installed when they had first built this house 15 years ago. Benjamin was in his study, a glass of whiskey already in his hand, though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. He looked up when she entered, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Eleanor, girl, do not let that fool Morrison get under your skin," he said, his voice rough with emotion and drink. "He was not worthy of you anyway. Too much pride and not enough sense." "They are all the same, Papa," Eleanor replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. The study smelled of tobacco and old paper, comforting scents that reminded her of safety and childhood. "They want heirs, and I cannot give them that. Perhaps it is time we stopped this charade of courtship." Benjamin set down his glass with enough force to make the amber liquid slosh against the sides. "You deserve a husband, Eleanor. You deserve love and companionship. Your mother and I, we had something special, and I want that for you." "Mama could give you children," Eleanor said quietly, the old pain rising up like bile in her throat. "I cannot. That changes everything out here." Her father opened his mouth to argue, but they were interrupted by a knock on the front door. Eleanor rose to answer it, grateful for the interruption, and found herself face to face with their foreman, Carlos Mendoza, a weathered man of 50 who had worked for her father since before Eleanor was born. "Miss Eleanor, Mr. Hartwell," Carlos said, removing his hat respectfully. "We have got a problem down at the south pasture. Some of the fence is down, and we have lost maybe 20 head through the gap. We need more hands to ride out and bring them back before they scatter too far, or the rustlers find them." Benjamin was on his feet immediately, his earlier melancholy forgotten in the face of practical crisis. "Get the men ready. I will be down in 5 minutes." Eleanor followed her father as he gathered his hat and gun belt. "I am coming with you," she announced, expecting his protest. "Eleanor, it could be dangerous. If there are rustlers—" "Papa, I am a better tracker than half your men, and you know it. You need every capable rider you have, and I am not going to sit here and embroider while our cattle wander off into the wilderness." Benjamin looked at his daughter, and Eleanor saw the moment he recognized the determination in her eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw that her mother had possessed. He nodded once, sharply. "Get your riding clothes on. We leave in 10 minutes. Eleanor changed quickly into her split riding skirt and a practical cotton blouse, pulling on her worn leather boots and the wide-brimmed hat that protected her fair skin from the brutal Texas sun. She braided her long auburn hair into a practical plait and strapped on the small revolver her father had taught her to shoot when she was 16. Within the promised 10 minutes, she was mounted on her favorite horse, a steady mare named Copper, and riding out with her father and 6 ranch hands toward the south pasture. The August heat was oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned the distant hills into wavering mirages. Eleanor could feel sweat trickling down her spine, but she kept pace with the men, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of their missing cattle. The south pasture was nearly an hour's ride from the main house, situated in a valley between 2 rocky hills that provided some shelter from the worst of the summer winds. When they reached the downed fence, Carlos was already there with 2 other hands, examining the broken posts and scattered wire. "This was not weather damage," he said grimly, showing Benjamin where the wire had been cut clean through. "Someone did this deliberately." Eleanor dismounted and knelt beside one of the posts, running her fingers over the splintered wood. Fresh boot prints marked the dusty ground, leading off to the west, where the terrain grew rougher, and the land belonged to the federal government, untamed country that stretched all the way to New Mexico. "They went this way," she said, pointing, "and recently, these tracks are maybe 2 hours old. Could be rustlers, could be drifters who saw an opportunity," Benjamin mused, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Either way, we need those cattle back. Carlos, take Miguel and Jonas and ride back to get the sheriff. The rest of us will follow the trail and see where it leads. We will not engage if we can help it, just track and observe." The group split up, and Eleanor found herself riding alongside her father and 3 ranch hands. Tom Bradley, a young man of 22 who had been with them for 2 years. Samuel Sam Chen, whose father had come from China to work on the railroads, and who had drifted down to Texas seeking ranch work, and a new hand they had hired just last month. A cowboy who went by the name of James Callahan. Eleanor had noticed James around the ranch, though they had not spoken much beyond basic pleasantries. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of smoke. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, and there was a quiet competence about him that Eleanor appreciated. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and measured. Unlike many of the other hands, he treated Eleanor with the same respect he showed her father, never acting as if her presence was unusual or inappropriate. They followed the trail west for over an hour, the sun beating down mercilessly, and the landscape growing increasingly wild. Eleanor was grateful for the water in her canteen and the shade from her hat, but she could feel the heat sapping her strength. Beside her, James Callahan rode with his eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail of the terrain. Once, he held up a hand to halt the group, pointing to fresh droppings that confirmed they were on the right track. "They are pushing the cattle hard," James observed, his voice low and calm. "Trying to cover ground before anyone notices. They will have to slow down soon, though, or risk losing animals to exhaustion." Benjamin nodded approvingly. "Good eye, Callahan. How much further do you reckon?" James studied the horizon, where a line of cottonwood trees suggested water. "If I were moving stolen cattle, I would head for that creek to let them drink and rest, maybe another half hour ahead." They proceeded more cautiously now, aware that they might be riding into a confrontation. Eleanor checked her revolver, making sure it was loaded and ready, though she prayed she would not have to use it. She was a good shot, but the thought of actually shooting another human being made her stomach turn. As they approached the cottonwoods, James suddenly raised his hand again, this time with more urgency. The group halted, and Eleanor strained her ears, catching the sound of voices and the lowing of cattle. They dismounted and moved forward on foot, using the scrub brush and rocks for cover. Through the trees, Eleanor could see their missing cattle, about 18 head, bunched together near the creek while 3 men watered their own horses. The men looked rough, unshaven, and dusty, with the hard eyes of those who lived on the edges of the law. One of them had a rifle resting across his saddle, while the other 2 wore gun belts slung low on their hips. 3 against 5, Tom Bradley whispered, his young face eager. We can take them. We wait for the sheriff, Benjamin said firmly. We know where they are now. No sense in risking lives over cattle that will likely be recovered anyway. But fate, as Eleanor had learned, rarely respected careful plans. One of the rustlers chose that moment to turn and scan the surrounding area, and his eyes locked onto the group hiding in the brush. We got company, he shouted, reaching for his rifle. Everything happened at once. The rustlers scattered, 2 of them running for their horses, while the 3rd brought his rifle up. Benjamin shouted for everyone to take cover. Eleanor dove behind a large rock, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The crack of gunfire split the air, and she heard her father returning fire, his old army revolver barking in rapid succession. Eleanor peered around the rock, trying to assess the situation. Tom and Sam were pinned down behind a fallen log, unable to advance or retreat. Her father was behind a thick cottonwood trunk, reloading, and James Callahan was moving, running in a crouch toward the cattle, trying to position himself to cut off the rustlers' escape route. One of the rustlers, seeing James's intent, wheeled his horse around and fired. James dropped and rolled, coming up with his own gun drawn, and returned fire with a speed and accuracy that spoke of long practice. The rustler's horse reared, and the man tumbled from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. He did not get up. The other 2 rustlers, seeing their companion fall, seemed to lose their nerve. They spurred their horses and fled, leaving the cattle behind and disappearing into the rough country to the west. Benjamin fired after them, but let them go, more concerned with checking on his people. Everyone all right? He called out. One by one, they confirmed they were unharmed. Eleanor emerged from behind her rock on shaking legs, her revolver still drawn but unfired. She felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that no one on their side had been hurt, guilt that she had frozen when the shooting started. James walked slowly toward the fallen rustler, his gun still drawn and ready. He knelt beside the man, checked for a pulse, then shook his head. He is dead, he announced quietly. Clean shot through the heart. He did not suffer. Benjamin approached, his face grave. It was a righteous shooting, Callahan. He fired first, and you defended yourself and us. The sheriff will see that clearly enough. James holstered his gun, his expression unreadable. Eleanor found herself studying him, noticing the way his hands were perfectly steady despite having just taken a man's life. She wondered what kind of past had given him such calm in the face of violence, what roads he had traveled before arriving at her father's ranch. They gathered the cattle and began the slow process of driving them back toward the Hartwell ranch. Tom and Sam rode ahead, while Benjamin stayed with the body of the rustler, waiting for Carlos to return with the sheriff. That left Eleanor and James to manage the cattle, working in tandem to keep the tired animals moving in the right direction. For a long while, they rode in silence, the only sounds the lowing of cattle and the creak of saddle leather. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "That was good shooting back there. You saved our lives." James glanced at her, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Just did what needed doing, Miss Hartwell. No more, no less." "You have done this before," she observed. It was not a question. He was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he would not answer. Then he said, "I was a cavalry scout for a few years after the war, saw action against the Comanche and the Apache. Then I worked for the marshal's office in Abilene for a spell. I have been in my share of tight spots, yes." "What brought you to redemption?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Men with James Callahan's obvious skills could find work anywhere on the frontier. "I was tired of killing," he said simply. "Tired of the violence and the blood and the endless cycle of revenge and retribution. I wanted to work with my hands, build something instead of destroy it. Ranch work seemed like a good way to do that." Eleanor understood that sentiment more than he could know. She too was tired, though her exhaustion came from a different source. Tired of being judged solely on her ability to bear children. Tired of seeing disappointment in the eyes of every man who learned her secret. Tired of feeling broken and incomplete. "I am sorry you had to break that peace today," she said softly. James shook his head. "That man made his choices, and they led him to where he ended up. I do not lose sleep over men who point guns at innocent people. What concerns me more is whether you are all right, Miss Hartwell. That was your first gunfight, I reckon." Eleanor was surprised by his perceptiveness. "Is it that obvious?" "You are still pale, and your hands are shaking a bit on the reins," he said, not unkindly. "It is a natural reaction. The fear comes after, when the danger has passed and your body realizes what almost happened." "I froze," Eleanor admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. "When the shooting started, I just froze behind that rock. I could not even draw my gun properly." "But you did not panic, and you did not do anything foolish," James pointed out. "You found cover and stayed put, which is exactly what you should have done. There is no shame in not wanting to shoot another human being, Miss Hartwell. In fact, I would say it speaks well of your character." His words were oddly comforting, and Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. They rode on, and she found herself stealing glances at this quiet cowboy who had just killed a man to protect her family, but who spoke about it with such matter-of-fact calmness. There was something solid about James Callahan, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a long time. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and pink that painted the whole sky like a canvas. The sheriff had come and gone, taking statements from everyone and pronouncing the shooting justified. The dead rustler was identified as a small-time criminal with a warrant out of San Antonio, which made the whole affair even more clear-cut. Benjamin had opened a bottle of good whiskey and poured drinks for all the men, celebrating their successful recovery of the cattle and thanking them for their courage. Eleanor excused herself and went to care for Copper, leading the mare to the barn and unsaddling her with practiced efficiency. She was brushing down the horse when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found James Callahan standing in the barn doorway, his hat in his hands. "Miss Hartwell, I wanted to make sure you were truly all right," he said, his voice gentle. "I know what I said earlier about your reaction being normal, but sometimes the shock sets in later, and I wanted you to know that if you need to talk about what happened, I am willing to listen." Eleanor set down the brush and leaned against Copper's warm flank. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, the question coming out more sharply than she had intended. "Most of the men here treat me like I am made of china, something fragile that might break. Or they avoid me altogether because they have heard the rumors about why I am still unmarried." James stepped into the barn, his expression serious. "I treat you with kindness because you deserve it, Miss Hartwell. As for the rumors, I do not put much stock in gossip. I judge people by their actions, and from what I have seen, you are as capable and brave as any person on this ranch. Even though I cannot have children," the words burst out before Eleanor could stop them, and she immediately wanted to take them back. She had never spoken so directly about her condition to anyone outside her immediate family. James did not flinch or look away. Instead, he held her gaze steadily. "Even though," he confirmed, "a person's worth is not determined by their ability to bear children, Miss Hartwell. It is determined by their character, their actions, and the content of their heart. Anyone who cannot see that is a fool." Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "You are the first man in this territory to say something like that to me," she whispered. "Then the men in this territory are bigger fools than I thought," James said with a slight smile. "For what it is worth, Miss Hartwell, I think any man would be lucky to have you as a wife, children or no children. You are intelligent, courageous, skilled, and kind. Those are the qualities that matter in a life partner." He settled his hat back on his head and turned to leave, but Eleanor called out to him. "Mr. Callahan?" He paused and looked back. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what you said and for what you did today. Both took a different kind of courage." James nodded once, then walked out into the gathering darkness, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and a strange new feeling blooming in her chest. Something she had thought long dead. It felt like hope. The days that followed settled back into the familiar rhythm of ranch life. The cattle were returned to the south pasture, with a new, stronger fence installed. The sheriff reported that the two rustlers who had escaped were tracked to the New Mexico border and were no longer a concern for redemption. Benjamin Hartwell returned to managing his ranch with his usual gruff efficiency, and Eleanor returned to her duties helping with the accounts and managing the household. But something had changed, at least for Eleanor. She found herself watching James Callahan as he went about his work, noticing things she had not paid attention to before. The way he was patient with the younger horses, taking time to earn their trust rather than breaking their spirits. The way he helped the other ranch hands without being asked, sharing his knowledge freely. The way he always removed his hat when he spoke to her, treating her with a respect that felt genuine rather than performative. She began finding excuses to be near him. When he was working with the horses in the main corral, she would happen to walk by on her way to the barn. When the hands gathered for the noon meal, she would bring out the food herself, instead of sending one of the kitchen workers. James never seemed to mind her presence, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. She learned that he was 29 years old, originally from Missouri, and that he had lost his family to cholera when he was 17. He had joined the cavalry to escape his grief and had spent nearly a decade in military service before mustering out and trying his hand at various occupations across the frontier. He had been a scout, a lawman, a freight wagon guard, and even spent 6 months working as a farrier in Denver. "Why did you never marry?" Eleanor asked him one afternoon, as they stood watching a new foal take its first wobbly steps in the paddock. It was a bold question, perhaps too personal, but she genuinely wanted to know. James considered the question carefully, as he did with most things. "I suppose I never found the right woman," he said. "In the cavalry, I was always moving, never in one place long enough to form attachments, and after that, in the work I did, it did not seem fair to ask a woman to take on a husband who might not come home some nights. I have seen too many widows left alone to struggle." "But you are not in that life anymore," Eleanor pointed out. "No, I am not," James agreed. "I am 30 years old this year, and I am starting to think about what I want from the next 30 years. A good job, a place to call home, someone to share my life with. Simple things, but they seem harder to find than I expected." Eleanor's heart was beating faster. "And if you found that someone, what would you want from them? What qualities would matter to you?" James turned to look at her directly, and Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze. "I would want someone honest," he said slowly. "Someone kind and capable. Someone who could be a true partner, not just a decoration on my arm. Someone who could weather hard times and celebrate good times. Someone who saw me for who I am, not who they want me to be." "Not someone who could give you children?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James shook his head. "Children would be a blessing if they came, but they would not be the reason for the marriage. I would marry for companionship, for love, for partnership. Those things matter more to me than legacy or heirs." Eleanor felt as if she could not breathe properly. Everything James was describing, everything he said he wanted, it was everything she had hoped to hear from a man. But she was afraid to believe it, afraid to hope that someone might actually want her for herself, and not for what she could produce. "Miss Hartwell," James said quietly, and there was something different in his voice now, something that made Eleanor's pulse race. "Eleanor, if I may be so bold, I have been working on this ranch for 5 weeks now, and in that time, I have come to admire you greatly. You are everything I described and more. I find myself looking for you throughout the day, hoping for a chance to speak with you. I know I am just a ranch hand and you are the owner's daughter, but I wanted you to know that I hold you in the highest regard." Eleanor's hands were trembling. "James," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I need you to understand something about me. The rumors you have heard are true. I was injured 2 years ago, and the doctor said I can never have children. Every suitor who has come to this ranch has left when they learned that fact. I cannot offer you heirs or legacy or any of the things that most men want from a marriage." James reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and solid. "Then let me be clear, Eleanor. I want you, not just children. If we marry and have no children, that will be enough for me, because I will have you. If we adopt children, or raise orphans, or simply live our lives together as partners, that will be enough. You are enough, exactly as you are." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, and she made no effort to stop them. "Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Truly?" "I have never been more sincere about anything in my life," James said, squeezing her hand gently. "I know we have not known each other long, but I am a man who knows his own mind. I have seen enough of the world to recognize something precious when I find it, and you, Eleanor Hartwell, are precious. You are strong and smart and beautiful, and I would be honored if you would consider letting me court you properly." Eleanor laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy that she had not made in years. "Yes," she said. "Yes. "I would like that very much." James smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face, and Eleanor felt her heart turn over in her chest. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply romantic. "Then, with your permission, I will speak to your father this evening and ask for his blessing to court you." "He will say yes," Eleanor assured him. "Papa wants me to be happy, and I think he already approves of you. He has mentioned several times what a good worker you are and how level-headed you were during the trouble with the rustlers." That evening, after dinner, James indeed approached Benjamin Hartwell in his study and asked permission to court Eleanor. Benjamin, who had been watching the growing attachment between his daughter and the quiet cowboy with approval, gave his blessing readily. He shook James's hand and told him that any man who could see Eleanor's worth beyond her ability to bear children was a man of character and wisdom. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced before. Her previous suitors had been formal and distant, going through the motions of courtship while clearly calculating the value of her father's ranch. James was different. He courted her as if she were the most important person in the world. He brought her wildflowers picked from the hills, bright splashes of color that she arranged in jars throughout the house. He read to her in the evenings from books of poetry and adventure stories, his deep voice bringing the words to life. He took her riding through the most beautiful parts of the ranch, showing her places she had never explored, despite having lived there her whole life. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, their pasts, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Eleanor found herself falling in love with James Callahan in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She loved his quiet strength, his thoughtfulness, his unwavering respect for her. She loved the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her words mattered. She loved his dry sense of humor that would catch her off guard and make her laugh. She loved his hands, scarred and calloused from hard work, but gentle when they touched her. And James seemed to fall equally hard for her. He told her one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, that she was the first thing he thought about when he woke up, and the last thing he thought about before sleep. He said that he had spent years wandering the frontier looking for a place to belong, and he had finally found it, not in any location, but in her presence. 6 weeks into their courtship, on a warm October evening when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken and the air was soft and gentle, James asked Eleanor to marry him. They were in the barn, of all places, where they had first had their honest conversation about children. James had led her there after dinner, claiming he wanted to show her something with one of the horses. But when they arrived, Eleanor found the barn transformed. Someone, probably James with help from the other hands, had hung lanterns from the rafters, casting a warm golden glow over everything. The floor had been swept clean, and there were wildflowers arranged in buckets in every corner. In the center of the barn, on a blanket spread over fresh hay, was a picnic basket. "What is all this?" Eleanor asked, delighted and confused. James took both her hands in his. "Eleanor, I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but I'm not getting any younger, and I know my own heart. These past 6 weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You make me want to be a better man. You make me laugh and think and feel things I did not know I was capable of feeling. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, waking up beside you and falling asleep beside you and facing whatever comes our way together." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band with a small sapphire set in the center, the blue stone catching the lantern light. "This was my mother's ring," James said softly. "It is the only thing I have left of my family. I would be honored if you would wear it as my wife. Eleanor Hartwell, will you marry me?" Eleanor could barely see through her tears. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that was tender and passionate and full of promise. Eleanor melted into him, feeling safe and cherished and wanted in a way she had never experienced before. They were married 6 weeks later, in November of 1878, in a simple ceremony at the church in Redemption. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, which fit her as if it had been made for her measurements. Benjamin walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when he placed Eleanor's hand in James's, he whispered, "Take care of my girl." "With my life," James promised, and Benjamin believed him. The whole town turned out for the wedding, and if anyone had anything negative to say about Eleanor's inability to have children, they kept it to themselves in the face of the obvious love between the bride and groom. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Matthews, who had known Eleanor since she was a child, and who spoke movingly about how marriage was about more than procreation. It was about two souls joining together to face life as partners. The reception was held at the Hartwell Ranch, with tables set up in the yard, and more food than the assembled guests could possibly eat. There was music and dancing, and Eleanor found herself swept into James's arms for waltz after waltz, dizzy with happiness and the surreal feeling that this was actually happening, that she was actually married to this wonderful man who wanted her exactly as she was. As the sun set and the party continued around them, James pulled Eleanor aside to a quiet corner of the yard. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face. "I have never been happier," Eleanor said honestly. "I did not think this was possible for me. I thought I would spend my life alone, unmarried and pitied. You changed everything, James." "You changed everything for me, too," James said, cupping her face in his hands. "I was drifting before I came here, going through the motions of living but not really alive. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build a future instead of just surviving day to day." They kissed again, and Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not the calculated courtships she had endured before, but this deep connection, this sense of coming home to a person rather than a place. Benjamin had given them his blessing to add a room onto the ranch house for their private quarters, but James had surprised everyone by using his savings to purchase a small parcel of land about 3 miles from the main Hartwell ranch. It was only 100 acres, but it had good water and decent grazing, and there was a small cabin already built on the property. "I want us to have our own place," James had explained to Eleanor when he showed her the land. "Not because I do not appreciate your father's generosity, but because I want to build something that is ours. We will be close enough to help on the ranch, but we will have our own home, our own life." Eleanor had loved him even more for that, for understanding that she needed some independence even as she remained close to her father. They moved into the cabin the day after the wedding, and though it was small and rustic compared to the Hartwell ranch house, Eleanor had never loved a place more. The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. They learned each other's habits and preferences, their moods and quirks. Eleanor discovered that James was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise with a cup of coffee, that he had a beautiful singing voice he only used when he thought no one was listening, and that he had a fear of thunderstorms that dated back to childhood. James learned that Eleanor could not cook to save her life, but was brilliant with numbers and planning, that she had read every book in her father's library twice, and that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide when she thought she was right about something. They also learned each other physically, navigating the intimate aspects of marriage with patience and tenderness. Eleanor had been nervous about this part of married life, worried that her injuries might make things difficult or painful. But James was gentle and attentive, always making sure she was comfortable and happy. Their physical relationship deepened their emotional bond, creating an intimacy that Eleanor had never imagined possible. But even in the midst of their happiness, the question of children hung in the air like an unspoken presence. Eleanor knew that James had meant what he said about not needing children, but she also knew that most men eventually wanted heirs, whether they admitted it or not. She watched him carefully for signs of regret or disappointment, but saw none. James seemed genuinely content with their life together, working his small ranch with her help, and spending his evenings in her company. Still, Eleanor could not shake the feeling that she was somehow cheating James out of something important. This feeling came to a head one evening in March of 1879, 4 months after their wedding. They had been invited to dinner at a neighboring ranch where the hosts had just welcomed their 4th child. A bouncing baby boy they were clearly over the moon about. The entire evening had been full of talk about children, babies, the joys of parenthood. Eleanor had smiled and made the appropriate noises, but inside she had felt hollow and inadequate. On the ride home, she was quiet, and James noticed. "You have been silent since we left the Johnsons' place," he observed as they rode side by side through the darkness. "What is troubling you?" Eleanor considered lying, saying she was just tired, but she had promised herself she would always be honest with James. "Did it bother you?" she asked. "All that talk about children and family legacy? Did it make you wish things were different with us?" James pulled his horse to a stop, and Eleanor did the same. He dismounted and came to help her down, then held both her hands in his. The moonlight was bright enough that she could see his face clearly, the seriousness in his expression. "Eleanor, I need you to hear me and believe me," he said firmly. "I do not wish things were different with us. I do not lie awake at night regretting our marriage or wishing you could bear children. I married you because I love you, because you make my life better in every way that matters. If children are not part of our future, then they are not part of our future, and I am at peace with that." "But what about legacy?" Eleanor pressed. "What about passing on your name, your land, your knowledge? Do you not want that?" James was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There are many ways to leave a legacy," he finally said. "We could adopt children if you wanted to, or take in orphans who need a home. We could foster children who need temporary care. We could mentor young people in the community, pass on our knowledge and skills that way. Or we could simply live good lives, treat people with kindness and respect, and let that be our legacy. There is no one right way to make a mark on the world, Eleanor." His words eased something tight in Eleanor's chest, but she had to ask one more question. "And if I wanted to try to adopt, would you be open to that?" James smiled. "If that is what you want, then yes, I would be very open to that. But only if it is what you want, not because you think it is what I need. I am happy with our life as it is, with just the two of us. Any children would be an addition to our happiness, not the source of it." Eleanor threw her arms around him, overwhelmed with love and gratitude. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" she whispered against his chest. "I ask myself the same question every day," James replied, holding her close. They stood there for a long moment under the stars, just holding each other, before remounting and continuing home. And something had shifted for Eleanor. She realized that she had been so focused on what she could not give James that she had not fully appreciated what she could give him: her love, her partnership, her presence in his life. Those things were valuable, maybe even more valuable than children, and James recognized that even if society did not. Over the next year, Eleanor and James built a good life together. They expanded their small ranch, adding more cattle and a few horses that James trained for sale. Eleanor took over the books not just for their ranch, but for her father's as well, her skill with numbers saving Benjamin hundreds of dollars through her careful management. James became known throughout the county as an expert horse trainer, and people came from as far as Austin to buy horses he had worked with. They also became more involved in the community. James helped organize a volunteer group to maintain the roads and fences around Redemption. Eleanor started a lending library in town, donating books from her father's collection and encouraging others to do the same. They attended church regularly, participated in town socials, and generally became respected members of the community. And gradually, Eleanor began to hear less whispering about her inability to have children. People saw how happy she and James were together, how well they worked as a team, and the talk shifted from pity to admiration. They were viewed as a solid couple, dependable and kind, the type of people you wanted as neighbors. In the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after their marriage, Eleanor was helping organize a church fundraiser when Reverend Matthews approached her with an unusual request. "Eleanor, I know this is a sensitive subject, but I wanted to speak with you and James about something," the Reverend said, his expression serious. "There is a situation that has arisen, and I immediately thought of you two." "What kind of situation?" Eleanor asked, curious. "There are 2 children who need a home," Reverend Matthews explained. "Their parents died of pneumonia last month, leaving them orphaned. They have no family willing to take them in, and unless someone steps forward, they will be sent to the orphanage in San Antonio. They are good children, well-behaved and kind, but they need a stable home with people who will love them." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "How old are they?" "The boy is 7 and the girl is 5, the Reverend said. "Their names are Michael and Sarah. They have been staying with different families temporarily, but no one can take them permanently. I know you and James have built a good life, and I thought perhaps you might consider providing a home for them." Eleanor felt a rush of emotions: excitement, fear, hope, uncertainty. "I would need to speak with James," she said carefully. "This would be a decision we would make together." "Of course." Reverend Matthews agreed. "Take your time and pray on it. The children are safe for now, but a permanent solution would ease everyone's minds." That evening, Eleanor told James about the conversation. They were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, and she explained the situation carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. James listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When Eleanor finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "What do you want to do, Eleanor? How do you feel about taking in these children?" "I think," Eleanor said slowly, working through her feelings as she spoke, "I think I would like to meet them first, see what they are like. But James, this would change everything for us. Our quiet life, just the two of us, that would be over. We would be responsible for 2 young lives, for raising them and caring for them. It is a huge commitment." "It is," James agreed. "But is it a commitment you want to make?" Eleanor thought about Michael and Sarah, 2 children who had lost their parents and their home through no fault of their own. She thought about how she and James had space in their house and in their lives, how they had love to give. She thought about how she had always imagined herself as a mother, even after learning she could not bear children, and how this might be her chance to fulfill that role in a different way. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I do want to make that commitment, but only if you do too. I will not ask you to take on children if your heart is not in it." James reached over and took her hand. "My heart is in anything that makes you happy, Eleanor, and honestly, the idea of giving these children a home, of being a father to them, it appeals to me. I think we could do right by them." They decided to meet the children before making a final decision. Reverend Matthews arranged for Michael and Sarah to come to dinner at the Callahan Ranch the following Sunday, chaperoned by the Reverend himself. Eleanor spent the days leading up to the dinner in a state of nervous excitement. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, prepared the best meals she could manage with her limited cooking skills, and worried constantly about whether the children would like them, whether they would be good parents, whether they were making the right decision. James was calmer, but Eleanor could see that he was nervous too. He repaired the porch railing that had been sagging, fixed a shutter that had come loose, and generally made sure the house and property looked as welcoming as possible. When Sunday arrived, Eleanor changed her dress 3 times before James gently suggested that any of them would be fine, and the children would not judge her based on her clothing. She settled on a simple blue cotton dress that her mother had always said brought out her eyes, and tried to calm her racing heart. Reverend Matthews arrived right on time, with 2 small figures clinging to his sides. Michael was a skinny boy with sandy brown hair and serious brown eyes that looked far too old for his 7 years. Sarah was small for 5, with blonde pigtails and a shy smile. Both children looked clean but worn, their clothes patched and their shoes scuffed. "Michael, Sarah, this is Mr. and Mrs. Callahan," Reverend Matthews said gently. "They have invited us for dinner, and they wanted to meet you both." Eleanor knelt down so she was at eye level with the children. "Hello, Michael, Sarah. I am very glad you could come to our home. We have made chicken and potatoes for dinner, and I baked a pie for dessert. Do you like pie?" Sarah nodded eagerly, but Michael just studied Eleanor with those serious eyes, as if trying to determine whether she could be trusted. James stepped forward and crouched down as well. "Michael, after dinner, I was thinking I could show you the horses if you would like. We have a new foal that was born just last week. And Sarah, we have a cat in the barn who just had kittens. Would you like to see them?" That got a reaction from both children. Michael's eyes lit up with interest, and Sarah actually smiled, a real smile that transformed her whole face. Dinner was a slightly awkward affair, with Michael and Sarah clearly nervous and on their best behavior. But gradually, as the meal progressed and James told funny stories about some of the horses he had trained, both children began to relax. Michael asked intelligent questions about ranch life, revealing a sharp mind and genuine curiosity. Sarah was quieter, but Eleanor noticed how she watched everything with bright, observant eyes. After dinner, they all walked out to the barn. James showed Michael and Sarah the new foal, explaining how to approach it slowly and gently so as not to frighten it. Michael was a natural, moving carefully and speaking softly to the young horse. Sarah was more interested in the kittens, and she sat in the hay for 20 minutes just petting them and giggling at their antics. When it was time for Reverend Matthews to take the children back, Sarah came up to Eleanor and hugged her legs tightly. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Callahan. It was really good." Michael shook James's hand solemnly, like a little adult. "Thank you for showing me the horses, Mr. Callahan. I would like to learn more about them if I could." After they left, Eleanor and James sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, both lost in their own thoughts. "Well," James finally asked. "What do you think?" "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that those are two wonderful children who deserve a chance at a good life. I think Michael is protective of his sister and probably trying to be the man of the family, even though he is only 7. I think Sarah is still grieving her parents and needs someone to help her feel safe again. And I think we could be those people for them, if they would let us." "I was thinking the same thing," James admitted. "Did you see how Michael handled that foal? He has good instincts. And Sarah's face when she was playing with those kittens, that was pure joy. They are good kids who have had bad luck. We could change that for them." Eleanor turned to look at her husband. "Are we really going to do this? Are we really going to become parents?" James met her eyes, and she saw certainty there. "Yes," he said. "I think we are." The process of adopting Michael and Sarah took several weeks, involving paperwork and interviews and home visits. The judge who oversaw the adoption wanted to make sure the children would be going to a good home, and he questioned Eleanor and James extensively about their finances, their plans for the children's education, and their reasons for wanting to adopt. Eleanor answered honestly, explaining that she could not have children of her own, but that she and James wanted to provide a loving home for children who needed one. The judge seemed satisfied with their answers, and with the strong recommendation from Reverend Matthews, he approved the adoption. On a warm day in June 1880, Michael and Sarah officially became Michael and Sarah Callahan. The paperwork was signed, the judge pronounced the adoption final, and Eleanor and James found themselves the parents of 2 children. The adjustment period was not easy. Michael, despite being only 7, had taken on enormous responsibility for Sarah after their parents died, and he was reluctant to relinquish that role. He was suspicious of kindness, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always expecting to be sent away. It took weeks of consistent love and patience before he began to trust that this was permanent, that Eleanor and James were not going to abandon him. Sarah was easier in some ways, more willing to accept affection and comfort, but she had nightmares almost every night about losing her parents. Eleanor would hear her crying in the small bedroom they had set up for the children, and would go in to hold her, rocking her back to sleep, while singing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. James was a natural father. He was patient with Michael's testing behaviors, firm but kind when setting boundaries, and generous with praise when the boy did well. He taught Michael to ride, to care for the horses, to mend fences and perform the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. And slowly, Michael began to open up, to smile more, to act like the child he actually was instead of the adult he had been trying to be. Eleanor worked on building trust with both children, but especially with Sarah. She taught the little girl to read, using the same primers she had learned from as a child. She let Sarah help in the garden, praising her efforts even when more plants got pulled than weeds. She braided Sarah's hair every morning, making it a special ritual that they both looked forward to. By the end of summer, the Callahan household had found its rhythm. Mornings were busy with chores and breakfast, with Michael and Sarah both expected to help, according to their abilities. Days were spent on the ranch work, with James often taking Michael with him, while Eleanor worked on the accounts or the garden with Sarah nearby. Evenings were for family time, with everyone gathering after supper to read or tell stories, or sometimes just sit together on the porch and watch the stars come out. Benjamin Hartwell was delighted to have grandchildren, even if they were adopted. He doted on Michael and Sarah, bringing them treats from town and teaching Michael to play chess. Eleanor's heart swelled every time she saw her father with the children, knowing how much he had wanted this for her. The community's reaction was mixed. Most people were supportive, praising Eleanor and James for taking in orphaned children. But there were a few who whispered that it was not the same as having your own children, that adopted children could never really be yours. Eleanor learned to ignore those whispers, focusing instead on the love growing in her home and the progress she saw in Michael and Sarah every day. One evening in October, 6 months after the adoption, Eleanor was tucking Sarah into bed when the little girl looked up at her with serious eyes. "Mrs. Eleanor?" Sarah asked hesitantly. She still had not started calling Eleanor Mama, though Michael had recently begun calling James Pa when he thought no one else was listening. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you going to keep us forever, or will we have to leave someday?" Eleanor's heart broke a little at the question. She sat down on the edge of Sarah's bed and took the little girl's hand. "Sarah, you and Michael are our children now, forever children, not temporary children. That is what adoption means. You will never have to leave unless you choose to when you are grown up and ready to have your own life. Do you understand?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I like it here," she whispered. "I like you and Mr. James. I do not want to go away." "Then you will not," Eleanor said firmly. "You are home, Sarah. This is your home, and we are your family." Sarah threw her arms around Eleanor's neck, hugging her tightly. "Can I call you Mama?" she asked in a small voice. "I remember my first Mama, and I still love her, but I would like you to be my Mama too, if that is all right." Eleanor had to blink back tears of her own. "That would be more than all right, sweetheart. I would be honored to be your Mama." From that night on, Sarah called Eleanor Mama and James Papa, and within a week, Michael had started doing the same. Eleanor had never imagined that she would be a mother, but here she was, and it felt right in a way that was hard to describe. These children might not have come from her body, but they had found their way into her heart, and that was what mattered. The years that followed were full and happy. Michael and Sarah grew and thrived under Eleanor and James's care. Michael became an excellent horseman, with a natural talent that James nurtured carefully. By the time he was 12, he was helping James train horses professionally, and people were starting to take notice of the boy's skills. Sarah remained quieter and more studious, showing a love of reading and learning that Eleanor encouraged by ordering new books from catalogs and teaching her everything she knew. The ranch prospered too. James's reputation as a horse trainer grew, and they were able to expand their operation, buying more land and hiring a hand to help with the daily work. Eleanor continued to manage the books for both their ranch and her father's, and her careful management helped both properties thrive even in difficult economic times. In 1883, when Michael was 10 and Sarah was 8, Eleanor and James received an unexpected visit from a woman named Catherine White, who ran an orphanage in San Antonio. Catherine explained that she had heard about how well Michael and Sarah were doing with the Callahans, and she wanted to ask if they would consider taking in another child. "Her name is Emma," Catherine explained over coffee in the Callahans' kitchen. "She is 3 years old, and she was left on our doorstep 6 months ago. We have no information about her parents or where she came from. She is a sweet child, but she has been slow to develop speech, and we are not equipped to give her the individual attention she needs. I thought perhaps, with your experience and your obvious love for children, you might consider giving her a home." Eleanor and James exchanged a long look. They had never discussed adopting more children, but neither of them needed to speak to know what the other was thinking. They called Michael and Sarah into the kitchen and explained the situation, asking for their opinion. "Would she be our sister?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "If we adopt her, yes, she would be your sister," Eleanor confirmed. Michael considered this seriously. "Do you think we could help her learn to talk better?" he asked. "Maybe if she had people paying attention to her and working with her every day." "I think that is very possible," James said, proud of his son's thoughtful question. "Then I think we should do it," Michael declared. "Everyone deserves a family." Sarah nodded eagerly. "I have always wanted a little sister." And so Emma came to live with the Callahans. She was a tiny thing, small for 3 years old, with curly black hair and enormous dark eyes. She was indeed slow with her speech, but Eleanor and James worked with her patiently, and within 6 months, she was speaking in full sentences. She adored her older siblings, following Michael and Sarah around like a devoted puppy, and they were wonderful with her, patient and protective. The Callahan house was no longer quiet, but it was full of life and love and laughter. Eleanor, who had once thought she would never be a mother, found herself the mother of 3 children who called her Mama and ran to her with their joys and sorrows. James, who had spent years drifting from place to place, had a home and a family that anchored him and gave him purpose. Benjamin Hartwell passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1885, leaving the ranch to Eleanor with the provision that James would manage it until Michael was old enough to take over, if he chose that path. It was a loss that hit Eleanor hard, but she was comforted by the fact that her father had lived to see her happy, married, and surrounded by the family he had always wanted for her. The Hartwell and Callahan ranches were merged into one large operation, making them one of the most successful cattle and horse operations in that part of Texas. James hired Carlos Mendoza as the foreman, and together they ran the combined ranches with skill and integrity. Eleanor managed the finances with her usual competence, and as the children grew older, they each took on more responsibility in the family business. Michael proved to have a head for both horses and business, and by the time he was 16, he was essentially James's partner in the horse training operation. Sarah showed an aptitude for teaching, and she started a small school on the ranch for the children of the ranch workers, with Eleanor's full support and encouragement. Emma, the youngest, was still finding her way, but she showed signs of being a talented artist, always drawing and painting the landscapes and animals around her. In 1892, when Eleanor was 38 years old and had been married to James for nearly 14 years, she realized that she had everything she had once thought impossible. She had a husband who loved her for herself, who had never once regretted marrying a woman who could not bear children. She had 3 children who might not share her blood, but who filled her life with purpose and joy. She had a successful ranch and the respect of her community. She had, quite simply, a good life. One evening that summer, Eleanor and James sat on their porch and watched the sunset, as they had done thousands of times before. Michael was out checking the north fence line, Sarah was inside preparing lessons for the next day, and Emma was at the barn working on a painting of the horses. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that Eleanor had learned to treasure. "Do you ever think about how different our lives could have been?" James asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she knew. "If I had been like those other men, the ones who only wanted you for your father's ranch and the promise of heirs. If I had walked away when I learned you could not have children, we would not have this." He gestured to encompass the house, the land, the children, their whole life together. Eleanor reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after so many years. "I used to think my inability to have children was a curse," she admitted. "I thought it made me broken, worthless. But now I see it differently. Those other men were never going to love me for me. My condition weeded them out, helped me see their true natures. It cleared the path for you to find me. Or for you to find me," James countered with a smile. "I was the one who showed up at your father's ranch looking for work, remember?" "Either way, we found each other," Eleanor said. "And you taught me something I had forgotten, that my value as a person was not tied to my ability to bear children, that I deserved love and respect and partnership regardless of whether I could give a man heirs. You saw me, really saw me, when everyone else just saw a womb that did not work." James squeezed her hand. "You were always worth seeing, Eleanor. I just had the good sense to look." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, watching the sky fade from gold to pink to purple. Then Sarah came out onto the porch, followed by Emma, and the moment of quiet reflection was over, replaced by the cheerful chaos of family life. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed beside her husband, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this place. The pain of rejection, the shame of being called barren, the despair of thinking she would never be wanted. And then the miracle of James Callahan, a quiet cowboy who had said the words that changed her life. "I want you, not just children." Those words had been more than a marriage proposal. They had been a declaration that she was enough, exactly as she was. They had been a promise that she was valued for who she was, not what she could produce. And James had spent every day of their marriage proving that he had meant those words, choosing her again and again, loving her through the easy times and the hard times, building a life with her that was richer and fuller than anything she could have imagined. As Eleanor drifted off to sleep, her last thought was one of gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that had taught her resilience, for the rejection that had made her appreciate true acceptance, and most of all, for the cowboy who had looked past what she could not do and seen all the things she could be. The years continued to roll by, bringing the inevitable changes that time brings to all lives. Michael grew into a fine young man, tall and capable like his adopted father, with a gift for working with horses that brought buyers from as far as California. On his 21st birthday in 1894, he took over full management of the horse training operation, allowing James to step back and focus on the cattle ranch. But Michael's real joy came when he married a sweet young woman named Rebecca, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, in the spring of 1895. Eleanor watched her son marry his love and felt her heart overflow with happiness. The wedding reminded her of her own, and she found herself remembering that November day in 1878 when she had married James, certain that she was the luckiest woman alive. 17 years later, she felt even more certain of that fact. Rebecca proved to be a wonderful addition to the family, fitting in easily with the Callahans' warm, welcoming dynamic. And when she announced in late 1895 that she was expecting a baby, Eleanor felt a surge of joy that surprised her with its intensity. She was going to be a grandmother. The baby, a healthy boy they named Benjamin, after Eleanor's father, was born in March of 1896. When Michael placed his son in Eleanor's arms for the first time, she looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. This child was not her grandchild by blood, but he was her grandchild by love, and that made him just as precious. "Thank you," Michael said quietly, watching his mother cradle his son, "for everything you and Pa did for me and Sarah, for giving us a home when we had nowhere to go, for loving us like we were your own. I would not be the man I am today without you both." Eleanor looked up at her son, this boy she had taken in when he was 7 and frightened and trying so hard to be brave. "You have always been my own," she said firmly. "From the moment I met you, you were my son in every way that mattered, and now you have made me a grandmother, which is a gift I never thought I would receive." Sarah married 2 years later, in 1898, to a young lawyer from Austin named Thomas Bennett. Thomas was intelligent and kind, with a deep respect for Sarah's education and her passion for teaching. They settled in Austin, where Sarah opened a school for girls, something that was still somewhat unusual in Texas, but that Eleanor supported wholeheartedly. Eleanor and James traveled to Austin for the wedding, bringing Emma, who was now 18 and about to start her own journey into adulthood. Emma had developed into a talented artist, and she had received a scholarship to study at an art institute in San Antonio. It was a bittersweet moment for Eleanor when Emma left for school in the fall of 1898, the last of her children leaving home. But she was proud of Emma's accomplishments and excited for her future. With the children grown and starting their own lives, Eleanor and James found themselves alone together for the first time in 18 years. The house felt too quiet, too empty. But they adjusted to their new normal. They spent their evenings reading together, taking long walks around the ranch, and traveling occasionally to visit their children. Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, in 1899, making Eleanor a grandmother of 3. Emma came home from San Antonio with a portfolio of stunning paintings and a young man named Daniel, a fellow artist who adored her and whom the family welcomed with open arms. They married in a simple ceremony in 1900, settling in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where both could pursue their art. Michael and Rebecca had 2 more children, daughters born in 1898 and 1901, giving Eleanor and James 5 grandchildren in total. The ranch house that had once seemed too quiet was now regularly filled with the sounds of visiting grandchildren, their laughter and play echoing through the rooms. Eleanor was 48 years old in 1902, and James was 52. They had been married for nearly 24 years, and their love had only deepened with time. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodbye before parting for the day, still talked late into the night about their dreams and hopes and memories. One evening, in the spring of that year, as they sat on their porch watching yet another spectacular Texas sunset, James turned to Eleanor with a serious expression. "I have been thinking," he said, "about everything we have built together, this ranch, our family, the life we have created, and I want you to know that I have no regrets, not a single one." Eleanor smiled at him, this man who had changed her entire life with his simple declaration that he wanted her, not just children. "I have no regrets either," she said. "You gave me a life I thought was impossible. You gave me love and partnership and a family. You saw worth in me when I could not see it in myself." "You have always had worth," James said, reaching over to take her hand. "I just had the privilege of being the one to recognize it. But Eleanor, you need to understand something. You gave me just as much as I gave you. Before I met you, I was drifting alone, without purpose or direction. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to build instead of just survive. You made me a better man." They kissed then, a sweet kiss that tasted of history and love and promises kept. Around them, the ranch they had built together stretched out in all directions, a testament to hard work and partnership. In town, their children were living good lives, raising families of their own, and in their hearts they carried the certainty that they had chosen wisely when they chose each other. The town of Redemption had changed over the years too. It was bigger now, more prosperous, with a railroad spur that connected it to Austin and San Antonio. The church had been rebuilt and expanded. There was a proper school with 2 teachers. The main street was lined with new businesses. Progress had come to the frontier. But some things remained the same. People still gathered at church on Sundays. Ranchers still worked from dawn to dusk to make their living from the land. And the story of Eleanor and James Callahan was still told, particularly to young couples starting out, as an example of what real love looked like. The couple who had been rejected and rejecting, who had come together despite society's expectations, who had built a family not through biology but through choice and love. People spoke of how James had seen past Eleanor's inability to have children and loved her for herself. They spoke of how Eleanor and James had taken in orphan children and given them a home. They spoke of the Callahan Ranch as a place where love was more important than blood. In 1905, when Eleanor was 51 and James was 55, they decided to take a trip they had been talking about for years. They traveled by train to California, something that would have been impossible when they first married, but that was now relatively easy thanks to the expansion of the railroad. They spent 2 months exploring San Francisco, seeing the ocean for the first time, marveling at the modern world that was emerging around them. It was on that trip, standing on a beach watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, that Eleanor reflected on how far she had come from that bitter young woman who had stood at her bedroom window watching another suitor ride away. She had been so certain then that her life was over, that without the ability to bear children, she had nothing to offer. How wrong she had been. Her life had been rich and full and meaningful, filled with love and purpose and accomplishment. She had been a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a rancher, a businesswoman, and a friend. She had touched countless lives, not through giving birth, but through opening her heart and her home. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I am thinking about how blessed I am," Eleanor said, leaning back against him. "How different my life could have been if you had not come to my father's ranch looking for work that day in 1878. How close I came to missing out on all of this. Fate has a funny way of working out," James mused. "I almost took a job on a ranch in New Mexico instead. But something told me to try Texas, and I am grateful every day that I listened to that instinct." They stood there for a long time, watching the waves roll in and feeling the salt breeze on their faces, grateful for the choices they had made and the life they had built together. When they returned to Texas, they found their home filled with family. Michael and Rebecca had come to stay with their children, wanting the kids to experience ranch life. Sarah and Thomas had traveled from Austin with their twins, now 6 years old and full of energy. Even Emma and Daniel had made the trip from Santa Fe, bringing Emma's latest paintings to show her parents. The house was chaotic and noisy and wonderful. Grandchildren ran through the rooms, playing games and getting into harmless mischief. The adults gathered in the kitchen and on the porch, talking and laughing and sharing stories. Meals were crowded affairs with 3 generations around the table, passing plates and reaching across each other and creating memories that would last a lifetime. One night, after the children were in bed and the adults were sitting around the fireplace, Michael raised his glass in a toast. "To Ma and Pa," he said, using the names he still called them, despite being a 32-year-old man with children of his own. "For showing us what love and family really mean. For taking in 3 orphan children and making us your own. For building something beautiful out of what others saw as brokenness." Everyone raised their glasses, and Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes again. She seemed to cry more easily as she got older, but these were happy tears, tears of gratitude and joy. "You 3 were never broken," Eleanor said firmly, looking at Michael, Sarah, and Emma. "You were children who needed love, and we had love to give. You made our family complete. And you taught us that family is not about blood," Sarah added, her arm around Thomas. "It is about choice and commitment and showing up every day. That is a lesson I carry with me always." Emma, the quietest of the 3, spoke up. "I do not remember my life before you and Pa," she admitted. "You are the only parents I have ever really known, and I am grateful that I got to grow up in a home where love was more important than anything else." James, who was not usually an emotional man, had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Your mother and I are the lucky ones," he finally managed. "We got to watch you 3 grow into amazing adults. We got to be part of your lives, to help shape who you became. That is a privilege we will never take for granted." The conversation continued late into the night, full of reminiscing and laughter and love. And when everyone finally went to bed, Eleanor and James lay together in their room, holding hands in the darkness. "This is what I wanted," Eleanor whispered. "Not just children, but this. This sense of family, of connection, of love that expands to include everyone. This is what matters." "This is what we built together," James replied. "You and me, partner. Every decision, every choice, every challenge we faced it together. And look at what we created." They fell asleep that way, hands clasped, hearts full, surrounded by the family they had chosen and who had chosen them back. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. James's health began to decline in his early 60s, his body worn out from decades of hard physical labor. Eleanor cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her throughout their marriage, never complaining about the extra work or the worry. Michael took over more of the ranch management, allowing his father to rest. Sarah visited more frequently from Austin, helping her mother care for her father. Emma painted a portrait of James sitting on their porch, capturing the peace and contentment in his weathered face, and it became one of Eleanor's most treasured possessions. James passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1912, at the age of 62, with Eleanor beside him. He had lived long enough to see all his children married and happy, to hold his grandchildren, to build a legacy of love and hard work that would continue long after he was gone. The funeral was held at the church in Redemption, and it seemed like the entire county turned out to pay their respects. Person after person stood up to speak about James Callahan, about his integrity and kindness, his skill with horses, his devotion to his family. But the most moving tribute came from Michael, who spoke through tears about the man who had become his father. "James Callahan was not my father by birth," Michael said, his voice breaking. "But he was my father in every way that mattered. He taught me how to work hard, how to treat people with respect, how to be a good husband and father. He showed me that family is built through love and commitment, not through biology. And he loved my mother with a devotion that was beautiful to witness. He saw her worth when others did not. And he spent every day of his life proving that he valued her. We should all be so lucky to love and be loved like that." Eleanor sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and mourned the loss of her partner, her love, her best friend. They had been married for 34 years, and she had no idea how she was going to live without him. But live she did, because James would have wanted her to, and because she had a family that needed her. She stayed on the ranch, managing the accounts and helping Michael run the operation. She spent time with her grandchildren, who now numbered 8, with the addition of 3 more over the years. She traveled to visit Sarah and Emma, maintaining close relationships with all her children, and she kept James's memory alive, telling stories about him to anyone who would listen. She told the grandchildren about how their grandfather had been brave and kind and thoughtful. She told them about the day he proposed in the barn, surrounded by lanterns and wildflowers. She told them about his quiet strength, his patient teaching, his unwavering love. Most importantly, she told them the story of how they met, how James had been the one man in all of Texas who had looked past her inability to bear children and seen her true value. She wanted the grandchildren to understand that love was not about what you could produce or provide, but about who you were as a person. Eleanor lived another 12 years after James's death, staying active and involved in her family and community until the very end. She saw Michael's children grow into adults and start families of their own, making her a great-grandmother. She attended Emma's first major art exhibition in Santa Fe, where her daughter's paintings sold for impressive sums. She celebrated Sarah's 20th anniversary of running her school for girls, which had become one of the most respected educational institutions in Austin. In the spring of 1924, at the age of 70, Eleanor Callahan passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the same bed where she had slept beside James for so many years. Her children found her in the morning, a peaceful expression on her face, and they knew she had gone to join the man she had loved for almost half a century. At her funeral, the church was packed with family and friends, just as it had been for James. 4 generations of the family she and James had built were represented, from Michael, Sarah, and Emma, down to the great-grandchildren, who were too young to really understand what was happening, but who felt the love and sadness in the air. Sarah stood up to give the eulogy, and she spoke about her mother with love and admiration. "My mother taught me that a woman's worth is not determined by her ability to have children," Sarah said. "She taught me that family is built through love, not biology. She taught me that when the world tells you that you are broken, you should find the people who see you as whole, and she lived those lessons every single day of her life. My mother was rejected by every suitor because she could not bear children, Sarah continued. But then a cowboy came along who said, "I want you, not just children." And that changed everything. That simple statement recognized my mother's inherent worth, her value as a person beyond her biological function. And my mother and father built a beautiful life together based on that recognition, based on mutual respect and love and partnership. They could not have biological children, so they took in orphans, Sarah said. They opened their hearts and their home to 3 children who needed a family, and they gave us everything: love, stability, education, opportunity, and most importantly, the knowledge that we were wanted and valued. My siblings and I will carry that gift with us for the rest of our lives. My mother's legacy is not measured in the children she bore, because she bore none, Sarah concluded. Her legacy is measured in the lives she touched, the love she shared, the family she built. She leaves behind 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren, all of whom called her mom or grandma or great-grandma. She leaves behind a ranch that employs dozens of people and provides for their families. She leaves behind a community that is better because she was part of it. That is a legacy worth celebrating. As Eleanor was laid to rest beside James in the Redemption Cemetery, under the wide Texas sky they had both loved, her family gathered around to say their final goodbyes. Michael placed a horseshoe on her grave, representing the ranch they had built together. Sarah placed a book, representing the education and knowledge Eleanor had valued. Emma placed a painting she had done of her parents standing together on their porch, representing the love that had sustained them. And on the headstone, below Eleanor's name and dates, was carved a simple inscription that Michael had chosen. She was enough. Because that was the truth that James had seen, and that Eleanor had finally learned to believe. She was enough, exactly as she was. Her inability to bear children had not made her broken or incomplete or worthless. It had simply been one characteristic among many, and far from the most important one. In the years that followed, as the Callahan family continued to grow and prosper, the story of Eleanor and James became something of a legend in redemption. It was told to young couples struggling with infertility, reminding them that there were many ways to build a family. It was told to adoptive parents, showing them that blood did not determine love. It was told to anyone who felt less than or broken or inadequate, reminding them that their worth was inherent, not earned through what they could produce. The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations, always managed with the integrity and care that James and Eleanor had instilled. The house where they had raised their family was preserved, and every year on the anniversary of their wedding, the family would gather there to remember and celebrate the love story that had started it all. And in that way, Eleanor and James Callahan lived on, not through biological descendants, but through the values they had embodied and the love they had shared. They had proven that family was about choice and commitment, that worth was inherent and not conditional, and that real love saw past surface-level concerns to the heart of a person. Their story, which had begun with rejection and pain, had transformed into something beautiful. A tale of a woman who thought she was broken, finding a man who saw her as whole. A tale of 2 people building a family, not through biology, but through love. A tale of a cowboy who said the right words at the right time and changed one woman's entire world. I want you, not just children. Those words had been a revelation, a revolution, a redemption, and they echoed through the generations, reminding everyone who heard them that love, real love, was about seeing and valuing another person for who they truly were, not for what they could provide. That was the legacy of Eleanor and James Callahan, and it was a legacy that would endure as long as their story was told. The sun set over the Callahan ranch, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that Eleanor and James had watched together for so many years. The land stretched out in all directions, productive and beautiful, a testament to hard work and good stewardship. In the house, laughter rang out as the latest generation of Callahans gathered for dinner, continuing the tradition of family meals that Eleanor had started so long ago. And if you listened carefully, on the wind that rustled through the Texas grass, you could almost hear it, the whisper of a promise kept, a love honored, a life well lived. The story of a barren woman and a cowboy who saw past her inability to bear children and loved her anyway. The story of a family built on choice and commitment rather than biology. The story of 2 people who proved that worth was inherent and love was powerful enough to overcome any obstacle. It was a story worth remembering, worth retelling, worth celebrating, because it was true then, and it remained true now. Every person has worth, regardless of their circumstances or limitations, and real love, the kind that lasts, is built on seeing and valuing that worth. That was the lesson of Eleanor and James Callahan. That was their gift to the world. And that was why their story, which began in rejection and blossomed into joy, continued to resonate with anyone who heard it. Because we all want to be seen for who we truly are. We all want to be valued for our inherent worth. We all want someone to look at us and say, "I want you, exactly as you are." Eleanor and James had found that in each other, and in finding it, they had created something beautiful that would last far beyond their own lives. They had built a legacy of love, and that was the greatest achievement of all.